Right, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Yeah, it's very bright. This panel is being kindly sponsored by THACM on how can we build more homes. I'm sure you know the format of these panels by now. We'll begin with some introductory remarks from each of our panelists before entering into a discussion and then a Q&A from the audience. So if you could all start thinking about what questions you'd like to ask, that would be brilliant. So from right to left, we currently have an empty space for Guy Opperman, who is feeding his 8-week-old son and will be joining us with our youngest ever panelist. We then have Freddie Poser. Freddie is the director of Priced Out. We have Rob Boughton, who is the CEO of THACM, who is kindly sponsoring this event for us. And then we have, to my left, Robert Jenrick, who is the Minister of Health, and formerly he was Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government. We then have John Myers, who is the Director of the YIMBY Alliance. And on my far left, we have Samuel Hughes, who's the new Head of Housing at the Centre for Policy Studies. So before we enter into our discussion, I thought I would put the housing crisis, and I'm sure we're all fed up putting the word crisis, into a bit of context. So in the 1960s, we built 3.6 million homes per decade. As of the 2010s, we've only built 1.5 million homes per decade. In total, that equates to adding just 8% to the total housing stock. Compared that to the 1960s, where we added 18% to the total housing stock. In 1970, the average house was £3,900. It is now £293,000, which is a 138% increase in real terms. We currently have the fourth lowest home ownership rate in Europe. And it's not just home ownership that's suffered. Renters have also suffered. In the 1970s, 10% of total income was spent on rent. That's now, on average, 30% in the rest of the country and 40% in London. Electorally, housing is hugely important to the Conservatives. We have some stats from CPS research that shows that 57% of home owners vote Conservative, compared to just 22% for Labour. And of the 365 seats won by the Conservatives, 319 were seats that had higher than average home ownership rates. So that provides a background to the current housing crisis. And we'll now begin with some introductory remarks from each of our panellists. So, Rob, would you like to go first?
Thank you. So, THACM, we are strategic land promoters, house builders, and partnership builders for the public sector as well. And it's an interesting question, isn't it? How do we build more houses? I think applying that to the current time and space, we've got to find a way to build them that is acceptable to the population. But I think there is a danger that we sometimes get wrapped up in a certain sector of the population and their views on house building. And I'm sure, given the panel today and some of the representatives, we're going to hear that from another perspective, which I think is hugely important. So I think the first thing is we can see the scale of the need. We can see the unaffordability levels within housing have never been so bad, and we have to find a way, certainly as a Conservative Party, we have to find a way to get more homeowners onto the ladder, younger years, and get the age of the voter down in years as well. I think it has to be infrastructure-led. I think it has to embrace net zero, and I think we as an industry have to make the places deliver what people really want, both in terms of homes and in terms of infrastructure around that as well.
Yeah, as a sort of card-carrying certified young person here on the panel, I think that we all know we need to build more houses. My friends who are trying to move to London at the moment, it's just awful if you can't live at home trying to find a place to rent. That's not just the cost, the sheer unavailability of places. We all agree we need to build more homes. But government after government has accepted this, or at least professed to accept this. Minister after minister has tried, and tried really hard under Thatcher. Two ministers failed to get planning reform through. There's lots of great policy out there, but the only game in town is actually what we can get done. I think that young people aren't really interested in, can we keep having this debate over and over again? It's who's going to build more houses. And I think there are millions of votes out there available for whichever party can really grip this crisis and actually solve it in the medium term. So what I want to see is policy that can get through, preferably this Parliament, and start making a difference as soon as possible.
Robert.
Well, hello everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here for this very important topic. And I think I've assumed in the last few years the sort of St. John the Baptist role in the Conservative Party of trying to encourage us to build more homes and to take the housing crisis seriously, and to think about what the Conservative Party actually offers to young people. Why would a young person want to vote Conservative? Well, an absolutely central element of that has to be that we are willing to take difficult decisions and build the homes that can help them to have a stake in society and get onto the ladder. And if we don't do that, then I think it's very difficult to see what the long-term electoral fortunes of the Conservative Party will be. House building reached a record level just a few years ago when I was Housing Secretary, and it built on a lot of hard work that was done by Sajid Javid in the first instance, then by James Brokenshire, and then by myself. And we brought house building levels up to their highest point for over 30 years, around 240, 250,000 new homes a year. And then, unfortunately, I think, a decision was taken to adopt really what can only be described as an anti-house building approach for about the last 12 months, an anti-supply approach, which really has no basis in economics, and I think was also morally wrong because it consigned young people and those on low incomes to a future without a home of their own. I hope that Liz Truss will change that considerably and will help to move that forward. There is no greater driver of economic growth than house building, no easier way to create jobs and prosperity in this country than to get the house building sector firing on all cylinders. I'm sure we'll discuss ways in which we can do that. What I learned as Housing Secretary and tried to pursue were that there are things we need to change in the way we build homes. They do need to be more beautiful, and we do need to have greater concern for what they look like and the design needs of local communities. We do need to have more infrastructure in place so that new homes are not simply being dropped on communities without the roads, the railways, the GP surgeries that people want. We do need to have greater concern for quality, because some of the volume house builders, I think, neglected quality in recent years, and that has damaged public perceptions of them. We need to build more homes in our cities, to densify cities like London, where the record of Sadiq Khan has been woeful in recent years. I'd like to see us do much more in inner East London, like creating a development corporation there to really get house building done. But I also am very suspicious of this phrase, building homes in the right places, which is usually put out by people who don't want them anywhere near where they live or they represent. People want to live and work in certain parts of the country. Of course, through levelling up, we'd like to change that over the course of a generation. But we do need to build more homes in places where people want to live, where young people want to build their careers. And that, I think, as Conservatives, forces us to make some difficult choices, be willing to take a short-term political risk for great long-term benefit.
Okay, John?
Thank you very much. I agree with what's been said. I think we need to see more small and medium high-quality builders like Thacum who live on their reputation and who have to produce good quality output in order to be able to continue. But first of all, I'd like to record my immense gratitude and appreciation for Robert, who has been an unflappable, unstoppable advocate for more housing, and who also had the foresight, the intelligence and the courage to be the first housing secretary to decide to adopt street votes, for example, as government policy. As you know, that's the policy for residents on a street to be able to write a plan for their street, granting permission for development of the types that they wish to allow, if at least 2/3 of the residents support it. And I'm also grateful for the support of the CPS over the years for that. That's one of the proposals the government is taking forward. Now, can we guarantee that and things like it will produce many more new homes? Of course, we can't guarantee that, but we do have some strong evidence that it's worth trying these approaches. So if I could take you back to South Korea in the 1990s, it had a policy where single-storey homes were allowed collectively to decide that they wanted to grasp the opportunity to redevelop, to regenerate, as Robert's just alluded to in East London, and to vote, therefore, to replace those areas of low-rise housing with much denser housing, much better built housing. Now that accounted for, those successful votes by a 75% majority accounted for half of all of the new condo apartments built in Seoul in the 1990s. So there's one example of that sort of mechanism working. In Israel, we've seen recently a similar kind of voting mechanism on a building-by-building basis produced 35% of the new homes in 2020. And in Vancouver, an incredible First Canadian tribe, which owns its own land and is sovereign over its own land outside the city of Vancouver, saw the benefits of developing that land for itself and is pressing ahead with the development of 6,000 new homes for its people. So on the basis of all of that, some serious people are happy to bet that street votes will help to produce better housing. They should also help small and medium-sized builders. But large vested interests will always argue the only way to reform planning is to push through the very reforms that benefit the biggest players. I'd suggest that some of those biggest players don't always have the best interests of the country at heart. And so if we don't try genuinely new and innovative ways to get the housing we need, we will remain condemned to housing failure. The future of this government and indeed of the country rests on avoiding that. Thank you.
Hello. So I'm going to, maybe this is inappropriate for CPS. I'm going to start with what might be slightly blasphemous. I mean, if we've got the analogy of Robert as St. John the Baptist, I suppose we should really have reframed this event as how can Simon Clarke be Jesus Christ? An important question for the salvation of the Conservative Party. So I wanted to take a step back briefly and think, do a little bit of background thinking. So I was at another panel a few days ago, and someone asked in the audience questions. He said, you've been all talking about this for 10 or 20 years or something, and lots of the same themes come up. It's more than that. In fact, it's 40 or 50 years. Why has nobody solved this? Why is this so difficult? Given that nearly everyone agrees in the existence of a housing shortage. I mean, there are people who don't agree with that, but nearly everyone agrees. And I think roughly the answer looks a bit like this. So imagine you're my local authority in Haringey, and you can permit 1,000 units to be built in some site in Haringey. Now, all the people who are negatively affected by that development, they're going to be people who live nearby. They're going to get loss of sight lines and amenity and disruption and building work going on next to them for 2 years and all this. I'm afraid I'm being outcompeted on the.
Crack on, keep going.
This is the next generation we're fighting for. All this stuff will be highly visible, and they'll kick up a huge fuss, and they'll make a nightmare for local members and try and get them deselected and write letters to the MP. And who benefits? Right? Who benefits is everyone who's a first-time buyer or a private renter in southern England. Almost all of those people are not in a position to vote for Haringey Council, and even those who are probably won't recognise the connection between very, very slightly counterfactually lower prices that they experience and this particular planning permission decision by the council, so they're very unlikely to reward the council electorally. So deep, built into the nature of the system, is a strong incentive to permit too little. And that works out in different ways on a national level. Contrast between concentrated and highly visible costs of development and diffuse and invisible benefits. And that's a simplified solution to an extremely complicated question, but that's one of the reasons why this is a really difficult problem to crack. Now, roughly, what is the kind of solution that would work here? As John says, most of the core answers were already there in the work Robert was doing, and a lot of the task now is to keep the key ideas from Robert's work, preserve them, keep them going, and get them into legislation. I mean, part of it is raising standards, raising environmental standards, raising standards of design such that new developments are less of a visual and environmental cost to local communities, Part of it is restructuring the way that money's value uplift goes from those developments to make sure that at least a substantial proportion of it goes to the communities who live closest to that development and who suffer most obviously from that development, so that they're seeing concrete benefits from this thing happening near them. Part of it is what John's talked about, street votes, enabling communities to create permission for development that benefits them, and there are huge economic opportunities. Another thing we haven't talked about, maybe we should talk about later, is estate regeneration. I mean, there's many places in London where there are opportunities for huge win-wins, where you could have estate regeneration done in such a way that it was a massive benefit for existing residents and could proceed with their consent and indeed with their championship and could create a great many new homes in areas of the highest scarcity. But all these kinds of solutions, the basic thing that unites them is aligning the incentives, sharing the gain from planning permission with the people who are currently blocking it, with the communities who are most negatively affected by it, and turning them, you won't ever win over the support of absolutely everyone, you won't get unanimity, but winning over enough people to be supporters and even to be champions of development. And, as I think John once said to me, we are sitting on value here. This is not a zero-sum battle. The prosperity we can create for this country through reform is so great that there is enough value to buy in, if not everybody, then nearly everybody, to buy in enough people. We just have to get the policy models right. So I look forward very much to your thoughts on that and to the thoughts of my fellow panelists in the discussion we're going to have.
Okay, I think we'll wait for Guy and Christopher to come back. We'll crack on with our discussion. So to begin with, prior to announcing his mini-budget, Kwasi Kwarteng promised that there would be supply-side reforms, including changes to planning laws. I was just wondering, of the panellists, what would you like to see in amongst those reforms? Freddie, would you like to go?
Yeah, I think what I'd like to see is something happen. I think I was at Labour conference just last week, and you can come up with a lot of great policies, but something that can actually get through Parliament is the real stumbling block here. I'm worried that, for example, the National Development Management policies might be too controversial. And whilst that sounds like we're giving in, perhaps sometimes you need to move backwards to move forward. And I think it's too late now to be looking for the perfect solution or trying to push something through, especially given recent political developments. Let's find policies, I think, like street votes or estate votes, beefed up estate votes that could deliver houses in the medium term and are relatively uncontroversial. Once we've done that, once we've proved that new houses doesn't have to be a blight, maybe then there's space for these more controversial policies. As I say, if you've got people and you've shown that we're tackling that, the party can tackle the housing crisis, then actually, hopefully the majority comes with that. But at the moment, I don't think that any amount of us talking to each other is going to make the case to people who fundamentally have the economic incentives aligned against them to vote our way, to vote the housing way. And I don't think that in the next 2 years you'll convince a majority of MPs that their political futures aren't at risk, unless we find these policies that actually are a win-win, basically.
And Rob, as a SME house builder, what would you like to see in these reforms?
What I'd like to see and what I think we're going to see are two very different things.
Yeah.
I think I'm particularly fearful that we're about to make life infinitely more complicated and see supply fall quite dramatically. There's clearly a lot of talk about top-down numbers. And whilst I absolutely understand the opposition to top-down numbers, particularly locally, the issue is that in the past where we've not had those top-down numbers, we have built significantly less houses. And I think there's a significant fear that we will now do so. And I think perhaps some of that comes from the perception of people locally, particularly politicians locally, local politicians, that, more houses means more objections, means less votes, means changing to a different party, etc., etc. I throw something there as a different comment, and that is that actually perhaps we should be engaging and evoking the opinions of a greater selection of the population locally. And I think there's a lot of the population that our traditional methods of asking them what they think doesn't reach. Traditionally we would hold consultations. in village halls, we get a certain part of the population that turns up. Actually, through COVID, when we held them online, we got a far greater cross-section of population to comment on those proposals and to give their support. And actually, when local politicians three times the number of support letters as letters against, they're less fearful to bring development forward. However, I do think that development must provide infrastructure and it must provide tangible benefits to the whole community. And I think we need to find a way to legislate that, to make sure that we're delivering the right things in the right places, but actually that the numbers are definitely going to be delivered, because there's a lot of councils out there at the moment muting some significant reductions in numbers, and that is not going to help the situation to make it tangibly a lot worse.
And Robert, Rob mentioned there that the government are considering scrapping the top-down housing targets. I think Liz Truss described them as Stalinist. Do you think that's a wise policy move for the government?
Well, I think we'll have to hear the details of what they intend to replace them with before we can really pass judgment on that. I mean, I think if you take a step back, the top-down targets, as they've been described, were created, ironically, by Theresa May when she was Prime Minister, although I think she lived to regret creating them. But they were designed because for a long time, local communities, when they created their plan, had to come up with a realistic and credible way of assessing the demand for housing in their area. And every local authority in the country, when they produced a plan, had to come up with their own number. And these numbers were often difficult to come up with. They were often rejected by planning inspectors because local areas came up with numbers, unsurprisingly, that were far lower than the true level of demand that their community had. And so Theresa's government decided to create a simple national way of doing that. And it wasn't a target, actually, at all. It was just a number, and then you overlaid on top of that all of the different constraints you might have in your own area, like you can't build on the Greenbelt. It's an area of outstanding natural beauty. You know, we're on a cliff face because we're in Eastbourne or Brighton. And then you came up in the end, after a process, with a realistic number of homes that you needed if you actually wanted to meet the demands of your community. So if you're going to have a plan-led system, it seems difficult to see how you can avoid coming up with a realistic and credible number about how many homes need to get built in your area. And you need a system that is defensible to come up with that number. So I think just saying we're going to abolish the number means very little. What are we going to do to replace it? And I would caution against coming up with a replacement which doesn't end up with a realistic assessment of how many homes actually need to be built in that area. Because otherwise I think we're letting down local communities. That's saying, well, you know, we're closed. You know, Maidenhead is closed, go to Mansfield. Well, I've never accepted that argument. I think that local communities do need to evolve. You do need to have homes for young people, for key workers, for those on lower incomes in those areas. And so whatever replaces it, I think, needs to be sensible and have some appreciation of demand. And as I said in my opening remarks, I think this suggestion that, which I think some southern members of Parliament like to say, which is that the southeast is very overheated, so just build all the homes in the Midlands or the north, displays very little understanding of the rest of the country. And I'm a Midlander. I'm born here in the West Midlands, represent the East Midlands. I can assure you that housing is contentious on the outskirts of Birmingham as it is on the outskirts of Nottingham. If you go to Manchester, the Greenbelt is a big political issue. So where you build homes is contentious everywhere, and the idea that you can simply say no in the south of England, but you know there'll be places elsewhere that want to build them is a fallacy. The targets succeeded. They were unpopular because they worked, and they encouraged local councils to unlock land that might not otherwise have been unlocked. And so if we are going to abolish them, then we're starting, if you like, a couple of paces back. And whatever gets brought forward in terms of supply side reforms needs to be sufficient not just to overcome that, but to make a leap forwards. And that does, I think, put quite a lot of pressure on the government to come up with innovative new reforms that actually make up that gap and go further. A few things I would just say that I think would make a difference. One is that what I wanted to do was create a bespoke route through the planning system for small and medium-sized builders, where we specifically simplified the way to get planning permission for those builders to help them and not just see all the cards, stacked in favour of the big volume house builders. That proposal is ready to go if the government wanted to do it. We created quite stringent targets for cities, many of which have not been building enough homes and have instead been pushing that housing out to the suburbs and the countryside. And I think that's the right approach. You need to push your Manchester city centres, your Nottinghams, your Derbys, your Leicesters to build more rather than just see those homes go to the countryside where it leads to needless building on green fields or even, in some cases, the green belt. I think we could go further on that. There is a very live issue that's preventing a lot of house building in the country, which is due to nitrates and pollution. This is not really the fault of house building. This is about farming practices and about the management of rivers. The action here is for DEFRA, for the farming community and for our water companies to step up and play their part. But we're losing out on tens of thousands of homes as a result of that. So I think that's a quick win that the government could cut through that and take action. And then finally, I would just say that, as the Prime Minister would say, I do slightly reject the premise of your question in saying that we don't know how to fix this. We were actually doing quite well just a few years ago. We dragged levels of house building up from their lowest level since the Second World War up to the highest level in my lifetime. It might be a good idea just to go back to some of the policies that we had just a few years ago, which, as I say, Sajid, James Brokenshire, myself took forward, like permitted development rights, for example, which have enabled thousands of new homes to be built predominantly in urban areas where it's less contentious, you've got the infrastructure, and people want to live.
And Guy.
Hi, so I have great freedom, partly because I've got rid of the baby. That's good news. And that may have been a significant interruption to what I was about to say. Secondly, the Prime Minister has genuinely allowed me to spend more time with my family by dismissing me as a minister. But I utterly endorse pretty much everything of what Rob has just said. I'd make 3 comments on quality, supply, and deposits. So on the quality, I have spent a lot of time with pension funds and seen the amazing quality that companies like Legal & General have built, who have built thousands of houses in places and flats in places like Manchester, Birmingham, up and down the country. And any brave new world, if you want to build more housing, has to feature an opportunity for pension funds to compete. It is also, no disrespect to the esteemed house builders here, by and large, they built much better housing. Why? Because they're not on a 2-year flip. Most house builders are on a 2-year flip to sell the property within 2 years. Pension funds have to keep the property for 30 to 40 years minimum. They are in the main trying to build for net zero because they're thinking post-2050, and the quality, in my experience, is way better. And also, if you're offering quality houses, more people will want to actually have them in their area. The second is you need to look at what I call the double donut approach. So again, this goes to quality. Go to places in Holland like Hogeweyk, which is spelt, because you're all going to lose track in a second and just go to Google. It's spelled Hogeweyk. It is an incredible place, similar to what they're doing in Almere, but that is a residential development with a rental next door to it and a care home at the heart of the donut. And you've got whole families of 3 generations all living in an interconnected way in just how we all want to live, near our families, having a care home in your community, having an opportunity genuinely to be at the heart of the community you've lived in all your life. That in a very dense conurbation, namely Holland, which has got huge issues in terms of housing. The example there blew me away when I went to visit it, and you had families who were literally living within 3 miles, but all of which is all developed, and all of this can be done. Go and offer that to a local authority. They will start taking you much more seriously. The second is supply. So investment zones are the de rigueur growth choice of the new Prime Minister, and to me that is a city deal by another name or describe them as you wish over the last 5 to 10 years. I don't mind. That's absolutely fine, but housing has to feature. Where you have an investment zone, which is the creation, fundamentally according to Treasury, of jobs and growth, that you have to have a proportion of that of housing. It tends to be the case that the investment zone is better if housing is there because they think of much more of public services. And the examples where you have proper mixed-use investment zones with proper factories nearby actually work really, really well, and countries like Austria have done it really, really cleverly. The third is deposits. It's a little radical, and I probably will get in trouble. So at the present stage, if I have a FTSE 100 company, I will normally offer the 8% standard pension under automatic enrolment as part of my pay packet. But because I'm a great FTSE 100 company, I normally offer at least 10 or even as much as 15% of a pension on an ongoing basis. I would stop that. I would simply say I will pay the statutory minimum, which is 8% on a private pension, perfectly fine. But I would then take the, in addition, 7% extra that most of them are paying, and I would turn 1% into a rainy day deposit fund for bad times and difficulties, but 6% would go to a deposit on a house or something of your choice. It would transform your recruitment, which, by the way, is really difficult at the present stage. Most companies have got a 20th of the applications they presently have. But if you say to a 23-year-old, don't worry, you'll be paid somewhere between 20 and 40, but a 15% pension, they're utterly disinterested. But if you say to them, you'll be paid between 20 and 40, and then we will pay you a statutory pension, plus within 2 years you will have a deposit for a house, they're really interested. It would also transform deposits. It doesn't mean to say the employer is paying any more. They're paying exactly the same. It's just in a different structure. It would be a game changer in my view, and I see no reason why it can't be done. It doesn't require law.
Thank you, Guy. Before I open up to questions from the audience, I've got one more question for perhaps John and Samuel. I'm sure we've got lots of local politicians in this audience, and I'm just wondering, how do you think we can get local support for building more homes? How do we turn NIMBYs into YIMBYs? John?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Samuel's written extensively and far more eloquently than I could ever manage on this exact topic, so I highly suggest you read his stuff, and I'm sure there'll be more coming from the CPS in the future. But councils face a problem because residents get grumpy, and councils are immensely resource constrained. Those who do have council estates have extensive difficulty in getting regeneration of those estates through where it's economically viable to do so. Targets, as the Soviet Union found to its cost, are not a great way in the long term of doing anything. But, as Robert is absolutely right to say, if we took away the targets without finding something workable in their place, then we will have a huge drop in housing production, and that will be very obviously disastrous. So I'm not going to exactly answer your question. I think there are things that can be done on making it easier for councils to produce estate regeneration that tenants can champion. And I think there are things that Samuel and his colleague Ben Southwood have written about, because if you look at the centres of cities, they tend to be either historic buildings or council estates and social housing at the very centre. So unless you want to go for high-rise, you need to find ways to gracefully add in those areas, and that has to be done delicately with local community support. But the last thing on this I'd say is to revert to your earlier question, there are 2 years to get something passed on planning. There are many things that can be done without legislation, but as far as a bill goes, if you look at all the previous reform attempts that have failed, they have failed because MPs ultimately wouldn't live with them. And so the question to ask if any proposed reform is, will it endure? Will it work and will it endure? Or will it be reversed by a subsequent government, either Conservative or Labour?
Yeah, I don't think I have a lot to add to that. People in local governments have this horrible task under the current system of doing site allocations, so saying, where is building going to happen in this local authority? Right? Who is going to take the pain? This, for elected members or indeed for local planners, is a totally mortifying position to be in. I'm not, I would never presume to tell people in local government how to do their job. I'm sure they're doing the best job they can given the constraints that the system has handed down to them. I also would stress, there is a sort of, you come across people quite often who like to blame local authorities for the low levels of build. They say, the obstacle here are the planners, or the obstacle here are actually, most local authorities either succeed in or come very close to meeting their targets or meeting the number that they are given under the housing need assessment for how much to build. So they're doing a fairly conscientious job, but working with a system which makes that extremely difficult for them. What national government needs to do is to make that situation less difficult for local governments by changing the system such that you're not just asking, where's the pain going to go, such that development can be opportunity, can be an opportunity, a social opportunity, even an economic opportunity for the people who are living very close to it, and perhaps even doing, as we've suggested under street votes, perhaps even giving some very local communities the right to generate permissions themselves, generate a mandate for change themselves, when that change stands to produce economic uplift for them.
Okay. Freddie and Robert want to join in this question. So if you guys could be briefly, before we get to audience questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say two things. Firstly, to obviously acknowledge how difficult the politics of housing can be, and nothing brought this home to me more than the Chesham and Amersham by-election, when I discovered that there were less than 100 houses built in Chesham and Amersham the year before the by-election, and a Lib Dem campaigner there who was involved in the council said to me that more swimming pools were built in Chesham and Amersham than houses the prior year, and yet they'd made this their flagship policy in the by-election. So you could see how potent housing can be often when it isn't warranted. But I was going to flag one policy in particular which we have succeeded in doing, or at least I hope so. It's in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, and this is the infrastructure levy, a complex policy which is not widely understood, but it was designed by myself with Tim Loynig, a brilliant civil servant who was working in the Treasury at the time, in fact, who helped to create the furlough scheme. And this creates a flat tax on development which is set by the local authority, so by councillors themselves, can be different in every part of the country, and means that the local council, and therefore the local taxpayers, can capture more of the land value uplift in that area. And if you are in a very contentious area where land values might be very high, like Chesham and Amersham, you could choose to set that really quite high, and through the infrastructure levy, not put off development, but get a significant extra amount of money into your local council coffers to pay for the roads, the GP surgeries, the new swimming pool, the playground, things that might, if not persuade residents to be enthusiastic advocates of development, but at least to help to mitigate some of their genuine and understandable concerns. And I think if we can get that policy onto the statute book over the years, that could be very beneficial.
It's funny you bring up the Chesham and Amersham by-election, because being a Lib Dem at the time, it was a really difficult, it was really awful, and got myself in quite a lot of trouble at the party by writing about how bad our campaign was there. But I think having met a number of young people passionate about housing who then go on to be councillors and sort of run into the realities of local politics really changed my view on how much of this we could solve by just shouting about NIMBYs and NIMBYs and NIMBYs, because in the end, the political calculus is so clear in certain wards, generally the more affluent wards, that we need to do policies like street votes or the value uplift accruing more to councils through the infrastructure levy to change that calculus, to actually... It's not about turning them personally from NIMBYs into YIMBYs, because any council will tell you that actually they're quite limited in what they can and can't do. That it is rules-based to an extent, but what we need to do is change the calculus for them to be able to support developments and give them the political cover and the political reason to do so, and shouting about it, even if we get the best young councillors who come in and really want to see housing, they'll get voted out if we don't give them the tools to go to their constituents and say, this is what I'm delivering for you.
Okay, so we're going to open this discussion up to the floor now. Okay, we've got lots of hands. That lady, just over there, Gerard. Thank you. If people could be pithy with their questions.
Thank you. Claire Bottle from the UK Warehousing Association. So I love everything that's been said about housing. Back in 2019, we published a report showing you need 69 square feet of warehousing for every house in the UK. And since 2019, two big things have changed to drive that number up. one of which was getting Brexit done. We're holding more inventory now in the UK. And the second is the growth of e-commerce, which has driven high street activity back up the supply chain into warehouses. So what I'm really interested to ask about is, now that DLUC is the department responsible for warehousing, a new development this year, what can we expect from the planning system to make sure that other types of development catch up with housing, please?
Okay. Who'd like to jump in there?
I think refer that very definitely to the Secretary of State for DLUC, and we will write to them on your behalf.
Okay. Should you like to?
Thank you very much. Several of the panel have mentioned about the common sense approach of developing, intensifying urban areas where infrastructure already exists. Is it, on that basis, is it morally correct if the majority of current residents are against the use of Greenbelt, to develop on Greenbelt?
It is morally correct, because in a local, it's not just the local views that are important. The key thing I think that many panelists have pointed out is that the reason people are against Greenbelt is not just because it's greenfield. It's wrapped up in so many layers of the current way we do house building, and different policies could change how that's done. But the fact is that very little of British, English land is built on, and we will probably have to see some greenfield development. The key is to see that as part of a wide mix of really high quality development that includes a lot of intensification as well.
Yes.
I think let's not confuse green belt and green fields to start with. I think, green belt is a term, it's a protection for current urban areas to stop sprawl out from those areas. And there is an absolute role for that. There's a role to control a sprawl of development out from our towns and our cities. I think we have to look at, particularly when we're developing in the green belt, if we're going to develop in the green belt, that it's absolutely in a sustainable location, very close to stations, and it's the right form of development, and it doesn't erode the purpose of that green belt around those places. Greenfield development is something that's very different. We have, whether we like it or not, a limited supply of brownfield, particularly in certain areas of the country, and housing is needed throughout the country. So we have to accept greenfield development in parts of the country. When we're doing greenfield development, then we need to do it the right way. We need to ensure it's some cases not so dense. It needs to be quite low density. And it needs to deliver infrastructure and respect the environment around there as well, I think is key.
If I could come in just briefly on that, Elizabeth. So there's a deep question of political philosophy in the background here. So how much should local communities control their surroundings, and how much does the wider country have a stake in those surroundings? And the answer, very, very schematically, the answer is obviously there's a balance to be struck here. The people who live somewhere do have a special stake and a special say in what happens to it, but that doesn't mean they should have total control and that they should be able to exclude forever anyone else from. And that means, we all know the moral case for building beautiful, high-density, environmentally sustainable settlements near to train stations in low amenity bits of the Greenbelt. We're all familiar with the arguments that can be given for that. That having been said, I would refer back to what Freddie said earlier. All of us in this room can solve the housing crisis easily in the abstract. Coming up with solutions on the back of an envelope for where we could build loads of houses and how we could change the legislative system of the country to bring that about is a very straightforward task. All the difficulty lies in the politics. All the difficulty lies in getting a coalition together who can actually get a not consensual, but a change that could get through Parliament and could then bed in and be politically durable. Now, we saw in Chesham and Amersham what happened not when the Greenbelt was under attack, not even when there were plans to attack the Greenbelt, but when there was suspicion of a plan to attack the Greenbelt. And they flipped one of the deepest blue seats in the country yellow on the basis of that. So I would urge everyone here, this is probably, whatever the moral case, and I have reflected much on that, whatever the moral case, that may not be the point on which our efforts should be directed in trying to secure a sustainable housing settlement that produces a lot more homes in this country.
I'm Councillor Tom Marshall from Lichfield in Staffordshire. First of all, Chesham and Amersham was mentioned. I don't live anywhere near there, but I think from my reading of the reports at the Times, it was largely to do with HS2 more than anything else. So I think that was the criterion, which was the stumbling block for a Tory victory, was the immense unpopularity of HS2. Unless, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that to be the case. My real question is, no one has mentioned the impediment that we face in this country in terms of house buying for particularly young people. How do we tackle high land prices? Now, I'm not a landowner myself, and if I was, I probably wouldn't be propounding this argument. But when people are paying well over £1 million an acre for land, then it's no wonder that small houses are costing a king's ransom simply to pay for the land upon which they're built. And I don't know how we tackle that. Thank you.
Robert, would you like to take that?
Yes, well, that is one of the things that the infrastructure levy can do. It ensures that the public benefit more from land value uplift and enables some of that value that would otherwise have gone to farmers and landowners to go to public good. And I think that's a very important step in that direction. I do think we have to just acknowledge there's a fundamental supply issue. We've had a bit of a phony debate in the last year where some people said, well, it's not about supply. I mean, it is about supply, and as Conservatives, we should be able to have an honest and intelligent economic debate. There is a fundamental undersupply of homes, and so we do need to build more of them. And I hope, actually, having spoken to the Prime Minister many times about this issue over the years, when we were Treasury Ministers, that she, I think, fully agrees that we do need to build more, and we'll try to find ways that are politically sensible and deliverable to do that. One policy I would just flag to you that was started, and I hope will be taken forward, is called First Homes. And this was something that I put into the Conservative Party manifesto and has begun, but in a very small way. And this is where, when developers bring forward a proportion of their sites as affordable homes, they can choose to do that either, in some cases, social housing, and that's clearly very important. They could do so as affordable rent, also clearly has an important role, although often is only a relatively small reduction on the market rent. They could do so as shared ownership, which again is a very useful first footing onto the ladder, although the shared ownership model has had a number of issues over the recent past. Or they could do it as first homes, and that's where they give a 30 to 50% discount to a local first-time buyer or a key worker, like a nurse, a police officer, an army veteran, etc., who might be finding it particularly difficult to get a home in that area, like somewhere like Lichfield, where house prices are really quite high by regional standards, and that will help to give some hope to local young people that there is a route. And when you're looking at signing off as a councillor a new development, you could think, well, I know that local young people in this area will get X number of homes, and that will be a useful thing to say to residents who might be concerned about the new housing that's coming their way.
And so I think we should have a diversified offer that, to a certain extent, excludes house builders in the traditional model out of the equation. And the reason I say that is because we're presently in a Dutch auction where we sell land to the highest bidder. And the highest bidder tends also to be the worst builder because they paid the top sum, which is why we all have such high criticism of the likes of Persimmon, Berkeley and others. Because whilst they do some good housing, the majority of it is high pay with a poorer quality build. So you have three options to address that. And as a local authority councillor, you have massive control, even without investment zones, even without city deals. What you do, as I say, you can give some land to pension funds who treat things in a very different way, but will build very much in a very better quality. You can secondly look at Almere in Holland, where they have and we are now required under changes that Rob and others brought in to offer self-build, where they have over 2,000 self-build, very small houses built in a development area, all fundamentally available to local people. If you haven't looked at and studied Almere and you are under councillor in this room, you must do so. It is, again, the Dutch showing us how it should be done. And the third is we should give tax breaks to businesses to build property. Most businesses up and down this country, particularly public sector businesses, have significant amounts of land upon which we do not build. All right? What we should do is we should take the example of Northumbrian Water in Kielder in Northumberland, who are a utility company, who are a quoted FTSE 100 utility company. And their staff were asked at the end of a very successful year, what do you want? And they all said, we'd like to live in England. So as a consequence, they took land that belongs to the water company, and they built some houses that first and foremost went to Northumbrian Water employees. You have very happy employees, you have an increase in supply, you take the local authority house builders out of it, and also, by the way, you use local house builders to do it, which is something that we all want to see. So you have three options there that as a local authority or as an individual mayor or a development authority in respect of an investment zone that would allow you to get much greater and better quality supply.
Rob, would you like to jump in there? Or?
Yeah, so I think the first homes is an opportunity we've just not exploited yet. We've not delivered it, not in any volume. And actually, the reduction that you're talking about in market value is what we would sell those affordable homes to a housing association for anyway. Right. So, you know, as the developer, we're going to get the same cash receipt into us as a business, so the model sits the same way. So why we've not done more of that effectively and seen that reduction to first-time buyers, you know, it staggers me, it really does. But I think it's probably the policy, understanding how it works, it coming through the system has perhaps curtailed that. And also, you know, there is a lot of land out there by institutional owners, particularly governmental departments and other areas that could be released as well. You know, and I know that we've seen that start to happen, but not in the volume. I still look at a number of schemes where Homes England has land. You know, that land is not going into the market at anything under really the market rate. So, you know, selling it to the highest bidder hasn't achieved releasing more land at a lower price, making more affordable homes delivered, if that makes sense.
Homes England needs wholesale reform. Absolutely. Needs a kick up the backside. Sorry.
This probably is a question for you, Robert. My name is Adam, I'm a councillor up in Salford, so it's nice to see that there is recognising that the Green Belt in Manchester is quite a political issue. I do represent an area in Salford where there is a development as part of the Places for Everyone plan that has been proposed. I wouldn't describe myself as a NIMBY, but I do feel like my proposals, or the proposals that Andy Burnham has put forward, are quite inappropriate in this area. So it'd just be helpful that whilst we should be building on Greenbelt, that where they are inappropriate, they do still need to be ruled out in those cases.
Well, if I could just answer that, absolutely. I mean, I think the Manchester example is a really good one. I mean, in fairness, Manchester, and you know, long before Andy Burnham, it's not really him. It was Sir Richard Leese and a history of very capable leaders of Manchester City Council have taken forward high quality urban regeneration. But latterly, Andy Burnham's response has been, instead of trying to push more housing onto the many, many brownfield sites that still remain within Manchester, to try to put housing, you know, in the lowest common denominator, the easiest place to build, which is on the green belt, which has made housing extremely contentious in Greater Manchester. And so a better route for Andy would be to follow the leadership of people like Richard Leese and get more homes built, more urban regeneration done in the centre of the city. And I think that would be a win-win for everyone. And we as a government can help. We have produced further funding for brownfield regeneration. And to Guy's point about Homes England, one of the first things that I did as Housing Secretary was appoint Peter Freeman as the chairman of Homes England, who is probably the country's greatest urban regenerator. He was the guy who created the mailbox here in Birmingham many years ago as one of his first projects, later on created King's Cross in London, which is brilliant, beautiful, has got homes, mixed use, all sorts of good stuff going on. So I hope that Homes England can have a dual role in the years ahead of helping to unlock land for new settlements in the way that it was originally devised, but also helping local authorities to do urban regeneration, piece together land, get a master plan together, have some government money to help get that going, and then to get in institutional investment of the kind that Guy referred to, and really get those developments going.
Okay. I think we can take two questions at the same time, and the panel can just pick.
Hi there, my name is Tom Bennett, I'm a councillor in Kensington, Chelsea. I just wanted to get the panel's view on a sort of couple of smaller pieces of the puzzle. One being the idea of government building on government-owned land. So Salisbury Plain is 300 square miles, almost as big as Greater Manchester. Couldn't we build some new garden villages or garden towns on government-owned land, maybe like Reykjavik? And the second one is we hear a lot about poor quality greenfield land, which a normal person in the street would not identify as greenfield, but is technically classified as greenfield. Is there some way of reclassifying that as greyfield or something like that? So
Hi, I'm Salman from London. This is a bit of a crude question and maybe too simple, but living in London, the rental market's terrible, the property market's terrible, but those are the places like London and urban areas are places where house prices are the hottest and where the property market's the most extreme. Why can't we, as take baby steps and liberalise planning in urban areas like London, where also we don't suffer the political costs, where these places vote Labour and we won't be losing votes, and places in the home counties we won't have voters moving from central London to cheaper areas that are marginal seats. How can we do that?
Right. Would anyone like to quickly address either of those points?
You go first.
John?
Thanks very much. So, quickly there is definitely a strategy in planning reform where the government tries to focus the pain in the areas where it doesn't get many votes. I would suggest that's probably been underexplored. It doesn't require legislation, so it's a very interesting and not at all a silly question. On Greyfield, I think we have to recognise that often people don't want building on that field because they don't want building on that field, and so ultimately calling it something else doesn't necessarily solve the question. But I definitely share the view that some of that green belt is not necessarily of the highest quality. And just going back to the gentleman over there, I think I forgot at the beginning to sort of lay the groundwork here, which is that since the Second World War, we have built less housing per head than almost any other major European country. That is why we have a problem now, and that is why we urgently need to fix it. But and it has got so bad now that land under dwellings, which is to say effectively the permissions for mainly existing, but some future buildings to exist, are worth half of all non-financial assets in the UK. So if you take all non-financial assets, half of that value is basically planning permissions. That is where we are in the economy now.
So you can transform housing in this country by having a 1% rule on public land. Utterly transform it. It does require Prime Minister to drive this forward. We've tried it and were robustly rejected by the Ministry of Defence when I was trying to persuade them to take 1% of MOD land for forestry to achieve some more net zero targets. But you could utterly take all public sector land and save serious exemption statuses. You could definitely do ranging from the Otterburn Ranges in my constituency to Salisbury Plain. You could absolutely got access to this. You could do it, and also the beauty is, by the way, we own it already. Planning is relatively simple. The problem is people like the Ministry of Defence kick off. It just requires a cross-cabinet drive forward. And it also, the beauty for the Prime Minister is, because clearly growth is everything, this could be done really, really quickly.
Well, a bit of good news for you. In the Health Secretary's announcement a week ago, we have agreed that the NHS will be one of the first public services where if they want to sell off land, they will get to keep the proceeds of it, rather than having to be redistributed or going back to the centre. And so that means if you walk past an unused NHS site in a big city centre and think that could be turned into housing and the trust could better use that money to build new hospitals or refurbish old ones or buy new equipment, then they have the ability to do that. And I think that's exactly the sort of thing we should be pushing to happen right across the public sector.
Just momentarily, Elizabeth. So on the that, by the way, is very exciting. The on the Inner London, the wild scheme for Inner London, it's very well worth looking at a map of conservation areas in Inner London basically you will find all of inner London is either heritage housing, social housing, or a few pocket brownfield sites which have mostly gone up to high-rise anyway. Now, probably when the Conservative Party is unlikely to believe we should destroy Georgian London and build it up at high-rise densities. The brownfield sites mostly developed already. Social housing reform may be an area that's worth looking at in this area if you want to add density in inner London. But there, still crucially important to look for win-win solutions, to look for ways of buying in existing residents and getting their support and championship. And I think that's still, even in London, the politically durable model.
Okay, I think we're going to have to conclude that here. So I'd just like to thank the speakers for joining us. In particular, thank you to Rob from Thacum for sponsoring this event. Please follow the CPS and CapEx on all our social media. That's Twitter, LinkedIn and Facebook.